Mr. Speaker, it's an honour to be able to enter into another debate in this Assembly, and specifically a debate around the budget for the province of Saskatchewan. There are a few debates that are as important as this one. Few moments in the political life of a province that are as important as the budget debate and the eventual support of the budget by this House, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, the deployment of services, the provision of services for Saskatchewan people. As a result, I want to once again thank my family for the opportunities I have to serve in this place while they're busy between Saskatoon and Swift Current living their lives. I want to thank those who help in our constituency office. Nola Smith has done a great job as a constituency assistant, and I must also thank Everett Hindley. Though we don't get along, we travel the province together and have for some time, and I'm grateful for his support, as I am for the support of colleagues in the family that we have on this side of the House and those that then support us in the respective offices in this building, Mr. Speaker. Before I make some comments around the budget, and I want to make way for the Minister of Finance. He is the one who should be featured today and, frankly, congratulated today for the culmination of the debate and an excellent budget for the province. But before I get into the main part of my remarks, I want to point out, Mr. Speaker, that none of the debate that we've had so far, no element of the debate, no item in the budget is possible without revenue, obviously, to the Treasury to perform the functions of government, to support what's in the budget. And, Mr. Speaker, we depend to a great degree for that revenue on the health of the agricultural economy in this province. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, here of late, in the last few years, we've seen the steady rise, the ascendancy of the importance of the agricultural sector, not just in terms of production, not just in terms of what farmers do and what ranchers do every single day, but also, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the innovation economy that's growing up around agriculture, even short-line manufacturing that we see, manufacturing exports increasing, related as well to agriculture, maybe not in our province, but in other parts of the world that need what our manufacturers are producing. The bottom line, though, Mr. Speaker, is just quite simply this. Without a strong and robust agricultural sector, we simply couldn't provide the public services we want to provide to the people of the province. We couldn't shorten wait times for surgery as we are because we have additional money to invest in that project. We could not build new schools in the province. We could not provide programs for those who have intellectual disabilities. We could do none of these things, Mr. Speaker. We couldn't hold taxes at a competitive level. We couldn't build highways and make investments in infrastructure were it not for the economy, and the agriculture sector is an increasingly important part of our economy. And so, Mr. Speaker, I was shocked when the Leader of the Opposition just now summed up the things that would be priorities for him going forward, reasons why he couldn't support the budget. And I think he listed 4 or 5 things. I didn't write them down, but I noted what he did not mention. Not a word in that list of priorities for the NDP about agriculture. Not a word of rural Saskatchewan. I followed up most of his speech. I think he spent about 30 seconds. He spent about 30 seconds on agriculture. Well, the member for Lakeview wants to intervene in the debate. He's saying, I wasn't listening. Well, we were. I think the member for Estevan counted. There was about 45 seconds in a 30-minute speech on agriculture. Well, what do you say about that, John? Now, Mr. Speaker, it's quiet on the other side of the House. It's quiet. It's a welcome quiet, Mr. Speaker, but it speaks volumes, that quietness does, about where this Leader of the Opposition has been on the agricultural file. And again, this relates directly to the budget. We simply cannot do the things that are involved in this budget without an economy to support it. The number one issue, the number one economic issue in this province, bar none, this year, and I would argue one of the most significant economic issues this province has faced in the last number of years, is what's happening with respect to green transportation. That's right. And so, Mr. Speaker, it would be shocking if the Leader of the Opposition, after probably, 70 questions in question period, it would be shocking if he had only maybe raised the question of agriculture 9, 10, 11, 12 times out of the 70. I think rural Saskatchewan would be disappointed in that the Leader of the Opposition, the gentleman that would like to be Premier of the province, has not tried to mention the transportation crisis in agriculture once in his questions, Mr. Speaker. Not once. It would have been, I think, alarming had the number been 12, 13, 14. But, Mr. Speaker, I think it is a disservice, and that is a mild way to put it. It is a disservice not just to rural Saskatchewan, but to all of the people of this province, that the party that would like to put itself off as the government in waiting, though there's only 9 of them today, that party would have its leader not once raise the issue on behalf of Saskatchewan farmers, Mr. Speaker. I would make this prediction as well, that as long as they are so out of touch with what Saskatchewan needs and wants for its leadership, they can expect their group not to grow beyond 9, frankly, in subsequent elections. Because the people of this province understand with clarity the importance of the economy as it relates to budget. They understand that, and they know that, yes, oil is important, and mining is important, and manufacturing is growing in importance as we see a diversified economy, and the innovation sector is important. But agriculture, Mr. Speaker, in the province that has 44% of this nation's arable acres is vital. It is a vital cylinder in our increasingly diversified economic engine. And, Mr. Speaker, the good news is this. Notwithstanding the fact the NDP have not raised the issue, the leader has not raised the issue, by the way, notwithstanding the fact that not even a letter has been sent to the Prime Minister or the Minister of Agriculture federally from the Leader of the Opposition. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, we know he's happy to write to the Prime Minister. In fact, in question period I think it was just a few weeks ago, he stood in his place and he asked a question to the Minister of First Nations and Métis Affairs and Northern Saskatchewan on the important issue of on-reserve fire suppression and firefighting. It's an important issue. He noted, by the way, the Leader of the Opposition did, that he had taken the time to write a letter to the Prime Minister. Fair enough. That's something he should do. We are also engaged in the issue, the Minister meeting with Minister Valcourt, for example, and raising our concerns around this. So we know then that the NDP, the Leader of the NDP, is happy to write a letter on a federal matter. And so, Mr. Speaker, how shocking it is that the Minister of Agriculture and the Prime Minister's office have noted there is not one correspondence, not one letter sent from the Leader of the Opposition, sent from the agriculture critic across the way to deal with the grain commodity transportation issue, to fight for Saskatchewan farmers. Anyway, the good news is this, Mr. Speaker. As long as there are women and men on this side of the House that remember upon what strength this province was built in the first place, that remember that rural Saskatchewan is every bit as important as the urban parts of our province or northern parts of the province, as long as there are women and men of that calibre and that quality on this side of the House, the government of Saskatchewan will fight for farmers in this province with or without the help of the NDP. Mr. Speaker, it turns out in politics that there's a balance here in this place, in the legislature, and in all arms of government, including on the opposition benches. There always needs to be a balance between talk and action. And, Mr. Speaker, sometimes in government we don't always get the balance right. Sometimes we do a little bit more talking and a little bit less acting than we should. Mr. Speaker, I think that's actually characterized some of the debate, and I've followed some of the debate of members on this side of the House and members on the other side of the House, and I've noted actually that on this side of the House, our members have said, look, here's the challenge that the province faces, are positive challenges of growth, but here's what they are, and here's what we're prepared to do. Here are the actions in the Minister of Finance's budget to actually deal with those challenges. There's been a lot of action on this side of the House represented in those speeches because that's what's in the budget, and there's been a lot of talk from members opposite. And I was in opposition. Frankly, that's what you do in opposition. You do a lot of talking because you're not able to affect change because you're sitting on the opposition side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Well, the member for Lakeview wants to intervene. Once again, he's talking, Mr. Speaker. And we're going to continue to act on this side of the House, but it's been an important part of the budget debate where we've been able to compare the member for Lakeview's talk versus actions on this side of the House. And, Mr. Speaker, what's actually been really interesting is to compare the talk from the member for Lakeview and his NDP colleagues even when they were in a position to act. It's an interesting comparison, and this budget affords that comparison. It allows us to make that comparison with the bright light of the chamber and all of the words in the budget. Because, Mr. Speaker, I want the legislature to consider, for example, the long-standing issue of summary financial statements. And there was, Mr. Speaker, as you will know, in this Assembly and outside this Assembly, dating back to the 1990s and even to 2002, and I think the Minister of Finance has some highlighted documents he'll share with us on this matter when he speaks to the debate. There was always, though, a lot of talk about summary financial statements. There was a lot of talk from the NDP when they were in office about summary financial statements. In fact, I think in about, it was 2004, they took an initial step to begin reporting both the GRF and the summary financial statements. What they're continued to do, though, to be, Mr. Speaker, is talk, including from our side, to be fair, when we were in opposition, about the importance of moving to a more summary financial report to the people of Saskatchewan in terms of budgeting. Well, Mr. Speaker, the talk now has stopped and there is action in this budget. I remember the finance critic across the way railing against the government, exhorting the government, please move to summaries. And I heard in his words, frankly, I thought I heard that if we were to take that step, if we were to just move to summaries, he would have to support a budget like that. I thought I sensed that in what he was saying because of the historic nature of that development. Never before in the history of the province, and I think that's an introduction to a sentence that the finance critic across the way has used. He likes to talk about what's never happened before in the province with respect to auditors. Never before in the history of the province has the auditor been able to come out on budget day and say, this move to summaries is a better way to report to taxpayers. That's never happened before because it's never been done before, Mr. Speaker. We replaced talk, some of it on our side, to be fair, but we've replaced talk with action. Mr. Speaker, for a long time in this province, and I remember it sitting in opposition, there was talk about the education property tax. There were talk about the disproportionate amount of education tax paid for, again, by rural Saskatchewan, principally by farmers. Mr. Speaker, an EPT featured prominently in the run-up to the budget, obviously, and that's why it's germane to the budget debate today. I remember the leader of the government of the day, the NDP government day, going to SARM at least once, maybe twice, going to the convention of the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities and saying, we're going to get it done. Talking a lot about the importance of reducing education property tax. Just trust the NDP, we will get it done, he said. There was a lot of talk. And Mr. Speaker, while the government talked, rural Saskatchewan revolted. Rural Saskatchewan had public meetings because they got tired of hearing talk from the government when they wanted action. Mr. Speaker, shortly after the 2007 election, after a report from the current Minister of Government Relations to the then Minister of Education, the current Minister of Finance, historic action took place in terms of reducing education property tax in this province. There was a lot of talk in Saskatchewan in years previously about reducing income tax, especially for low and middle income people. Lots of talk about that. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to report that as a result of the actions of this government, and there's an element in this current budget that's referenced, I'll get to that in a moment, as the result of the actions on this side, the talk has stopped, Mr. Speaker. And now the basic personal exemption for Saskatchewan people and the child tax credit has risen to the point where a family of 4 can earn more tax-free in terms of provincial income tax than any other place in the country. The talk from their side has been replaced by action on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. And here's something else. Lots of people were saying on budget day, you know what, we support this. This budget it's balanced, it moves to summaries, it makes infrastructure investments, and there are no tax increases, not to EPT or anything else, Mr. Speaker. Not even the so-called sin taxes went up in this budget. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance pointed out to his colleagues at our own meeting just before budget night that actually there is a tax reduction in the budget. About $6 million, I think, is the amount. $6.5 million, and the Minister of Finance corrects me as he's wont to do. There's a tax cut in this budget, actually, Mr. Speaker. And do you know why? Because we replaced talk of indexing exemptions, and that just means that those basic exemptions from paying taxes ought to keep up with inflation. The talk about that from members opposite has been replaced by action on this side of the House. And so now we have indexed for inflationary pressures the basic exemption, thereby meaning the families of this province, those who pay personal income tax, will pay $6.5 million less than they paid last year, Mr. Speaker. And more to the point, and I mentioned this on the social media. That seems to be an important source of question period support for the opposition. I mentioned on Twitter the number of people in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, and it's reinforced in this budget today, the number of people that have been dropped from the tax rolls completely. So these will be principally low-income people, moving up into the middle-income bracket strata, frankly. The number of people who no longer pay income tax to the province of Saskatchewan at all because we've increased the exemption, thereby reducing taxes, 114,000 Saskatchewan people, Mr. Speaker. That's action. Mr. Speaker, there was always talk in this province about cutting debt, and while there's not an additional payment of debt represented in this current budget, certainly it's referenced because, Mr. Speaker, we've had this debate and discussion about when we start saving for the future. Do we pay off some of the debt? Some of it's at 10% inherited from the previous administrations. Do we pay that all off and then begin to save for the future? And we're going to have that debate. But it bears repeating, Mr. Speaker, that those folks on that side of the House may have talked about debt repayment. On this side of the House, we paid off $3 billion in general unsupported debt in the province of Saskatchewan. We've reduced the debt of Saskatchewan by 44%, Mr. Speaker. Now, when I say unsupported debt, I mean the debt of general operations and governments. Governments will borrow in two different ways. They'll borrow in ways where you have a debt that's supported, typically in a Crown corporation, where you have companies, commercial entities that borrow, just like any other commercial entity, and then on a regular basis pay back both the principal and the interest of that loan. It's supported debt. And then you have, Mr. Speaker, I would call the bad debt. And that's general government debt where there isn't a regimen of paying the principal, where governments, especially those who simply want to talk about things, are happy just to pay the interest rate. So, Mr. Speaker, it's been interesting to hear the Leader of the Opposition on this debate about when we start our futures fund, when do we start savings. He says in a scrum, he says, well, we should start saving money earlier because people pay a mortgage and they save. Except, Mr. Speaker, that belies a complete misunderstanding of what general operating debt is. It's nothing like a mortgage. It's more like a credit card where we're just paying off the interest. And we on this side of the House said, we have to stop talking about this. We have to make some payments on the principal. We have to reduce the debt, and that's what we've done by $3 billion, Mr. Speaker. We have to stop just talking about these things and start taking action. Mr. Speaker, we know there's a $16 billion deficit in infrastructure in the province, and we heard across the way a lot of talk about that, in fact. In fact, we hear demands every day from the opposition that there should be an investment in infrastructure. And while they were in government, when they had a chance to do it, Mr. Speaker, of course, they were talking about it and not acting. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to report to the House, and it's built on in this particular budget, that we've now spent more than $16 billion on infrastructure during the last 6 years, building those hospitals, building long-term care facilities, record budgets in highways, partnerships with municipalities in terms of infrastructure improvement. We're acting on it, Mr. Speaker. We've stopped talking. Mr. Speaker, for a long time in the province of Saskatchewan, there was talk about better supports for those with disabilities. For a very long season, there was a lot of talk, including from the previous administration that had the chance to do something for those who are most vulnerable in this province, for those who unequivocally and in an unqualified way need the support of government. Mr. Speaker, there was talk about how, as Social Democrats, they cared about these vulnerable people. But, Mr. Speaker, when we inherited government, we found that there was only talk, it seemed. Because the Minister of Social Services of the day, the current Minister of CIC, brought forward to that one of those early cabinet meetings a report that said this, and this was a stark report, Mr. Speaker, by any reasonable measure. The report said 440 people with intellectual disabilities were on a wait list. What were they waiting for, Mr. Deputy Speaker? What were they waiting for that government to provide when they sat over here? They were waiting simply for the dignity of a home. And their families were waiting, Mr. Speaker, for some respite, some programming, because they were, of course, the main caregivers for these Saskatchewan residents, our people who had intellectual disabilities. So, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of the day, followed by the current Social Services Minister, has made it among the highest priorities of this government, if not the very top priority, to replace the talk and the platitudes from the Social Democrats with actions from this side of the House. And that list of 440 people waiting has been eliminated. Now there are other families who have come onto the list, Mr. Speaker, but it is never going to get to that level. And as they come on, we are finding places for those people to live, for the dignity that they deserve. And Mr. Speaker, in this particular budget alone, we see record investments for the disabled. Mr. Speaker, on this journey to improve support for disabled people in our province, the current minister had been meeting with the sector, and they made a simple request. They said, you know, we're not really welfare recipients. We're not really on social assistance, because that would seem to indicate there's more that we could do, and we simply, we can't do these things. And so we don't want any money right now, but could you call it something else? Because we don't find the dignity in what it's called today. And the Minister of Social Services came back to Cabinet and said, well, why wouldn't we do this? And so what was born on that occasion, again, action on behalf of that sector instead of talk, was the Saskatchewan Assured Income for Disabilities. Mr. Speaker, because it is an income source for them. And we've heard from so many recipients. I remember one in particular, and I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but I remember her saying to the minister and to the government and to all who would listen that she had family members that used to accuse her of being on welfare, and that hurt her. And then when we changed the program, without increasing the rates at all yet, just changing the name, she said she found dignity in that. She said, they don't say that anymore. Because I would do more if I could, but I can't, and so this is income support. And then, Mr. Speaker, we took it a step further. We campaigned on not just changing the name, but increasing the support for those people in the province of Saskatchewan, increasing that income support. And one of the biggest spending items in this particular budget is increased support for the Saskatchewan Assured Income for the disabled. That's action, Mr. Speaker, a lot more than the talk they used to receive from the governments previous to us. Mr. Speaker, members opposite also like to talk a lot about the importance of engaging Aboriginal people in the economy. When we inherited government, we found just a lack of any real functioning, credible programs that were delivering results. And it wasn't necessarily we shouldn't blame the previous government for it. We really shouldn't, because governments across this Dominion, across Canada, have found this to be very elusive. How do we find things that work so that we can better engage First Nations and, in our province, Métis people in the economy? Well, Mr. Speaker, we worked hard to make this a top priority. Before we go to Ireland to recruit people, before we even go to Calgary and get Saskatchewan people to come home, we must, in a labour shortage situation, first better engage First Nations people. If Aboriginal unemployment gap is here and the rest of the province is at 4%, that's a challenge. That's a problem, and we ought to deal with it. So, Mr. Speaker, we set about making some historic changes and investment in our approach to this issue, this gap in terms of Aboriginal employment and employment for others, including, Mr. Speaker, what ended up being, I think the Minister of Advanced Education can correct me if I'm wrong, what ended up being a 48% increase in funding to the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technology, Mr. Speaker. Lots of talk about the kind of programming we needed, the money that you needed to support programming, especially at an institution like SIIT that connects graduates with jobs and gets them involved in the economy. Lots of talk over there, a 48% increase and more in the budget as well, and that's why I believe those in administration at SIIT said after Budget Day, this budget is a good budget. They said it, Mr. Speaker, because it offered more action on that front and less talk than what they used to get, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the issue of adult basic education and the wait list we have in this province that we're slowly reducing, that we're eliminating, it's been a long-standing issue that's gotten a lot of talk again. Not, by the way, in this debate, I haven't noted it, but in the past, certainly. Mr. Speaker, in our growth plan, we highlighted a plan to eliminate the wait list for adult basic education, and funding for ABE is up 58%. And we've added 1,000 seats, Mr. Speaker. There's nothing more fundamental than getting that adult basic education available, not just to First Nations and Métis, but all who want it, because that is the foundation for what's next in terms of skill training, and that's how we'll deal with the labour shortage in this province and better engage people in the province of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, that is action and not talk. Mr. Speaker, with respect to education, and we've had a bit of debate even on it here today. I think it's important to note that, and the Saskatoon School Division came out today with some numbers about per student funding being decreased. Mr. Speaker, since we took office, the per student funding for that particular school division is up 33%, while enrollment's up 16%. Mr. Speaker, operational budgets for school divisions have increased, and what's more, what you've seen from this government again, it's unprecedented, and about action and not talk, what you saw from this government, I think a year ago, September, was us intervening mid-school year, I don't think it ever happened in the province, with additional dollars, and the former Minister of Education led this, additional dollars for growth pressures in not just Saskatoon, but some of the satellite communities there, and some of it may have even flowed to Regina as well. Mr. Speaker, in this budget, we have $18 million for similar growth pressures, I believe, pressures going forward. That's for places like Saskatoon. That's for places like Regina. It's for places like Martensville and fast-growing communities around the major centres, Mr. Speaker. And moreover, if the best indicator of future behaviour is past behaviour, we will have a minister who will sit down with all the school boards as we go through this year and fully determine those folks only ever talked about when they were government. Provide in-year increases, Mr. Speaker. That's what we've done in the past, and the minister will sit down with these groups and make sure that the provision of resources are there for Saskatchewan schools and teachers and the students, of course. And while we're doing that on the operating side, Mr. Speaker, in an unprecedented way, this government will build new schools in Saskatchewan. And members opposite will oppose new schools in Saskatchewan because they don't like the way they're being built. The Leader of the Opposition opposes a school in his own constituency because he doesn't like that it'll be bundled with other schools, because he doesn't like that it'll be financed in the long term. Doesn't like the way it's going to be financed. His education critic, also the finance critic, at one point demands more resources for education and then opposes new schools. He says, or maybe he doesn't oppose them. Maybe I'm not being fair. Maybe the education critic and the Leader of the Opposition support the schools that we've announced. Maybe they agree that we need one in Massey Place. Maybe they agree that all the schools we've outlined, both in the city and the country, are needed. But maybe their position is you can't build them except but the old way. I think that is his position, actually. I think that's what he said. And I think that's the Leader of the Opposition's position. Mr. Speaker, do you know what the deficit in this province would be if we were to simply cash flow every school in the same way that the NDP did? It's not possible unless you want to have a fiscal wreck on your hands, which we're not prepared to allow to happen. But, Mr. Speaker, it's a specious argument then from members opposite to say, build us a school in our community, build one build schools in Regina, build one in the Leader of the Opposition's constituency, but we won't support it unless you build it the old-fashioned way. And by the way, they know, if they're being honest with themselves, that the old-fashioned way would mean these schools would simply not get built for years and years and years, when we know the pressure is today. I think I heard the member for Lakeview say it's about choice. You bet it's about choice.
You closed one of mine.
On this side of the House, it's the identification of the fact that this province is growing, enrollment is up, and we're going to use sound methods, proven methods to build schools, but we will choose to build those schools now when they're needed, Mr. Speaker, and not make them wait for a lot more talk from the member for Lakeview or the education critic or the Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, we see another record investment in health care in the budget, and I just want to touch on it briefly before I give way to the Minister of Finance, because health care is important, and I think it's a priority for the Leader of the Opposition as well. He's asked a lot of questions on health care, not on the grain transportation crisis, but a lot on health care, to be fair. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would just point out we have another record investment in health care, but in terms of action versus talk, here again we see an additional investment in the surgical wait times initiative. We were able to see a report out, I think just earlier this week, that demonstrate we are well on our way to providing surgeries within 3 months for Saskatchewan people. This is a remarkable process that's underway. There's two reasons why we're able to do it. One is we have a growing economy and a broader tax base, and so we've been able to make an additional investment in the surgical wait times initiative. Here's the other reason we're able to do it. We're using private clinics. Mr. Speaker, and nobody's burst into flames so far. You know, Mr. Speaker, the projects are moving forward, surgeries are happening, and I've noted that the Leader of the Opposition opposes the use of private clinics. And that's fair enough. I look forward to that debate, and I look forward to the debate in the election campaign, because we're going to have the Leader of the Opposition advocating for the same old ideological way of doing surgeries, and therefore he'll be advocating for the same old longest wait list in the country that we inherited from the NDP and from the member for Regina Lakeview when he was the health minister. The longest wait list in the country. That's the NDP brand in healthcare. That's the NDP legacy. And so when this government has developed and demonstrated success in reducing those wait times by adding more resources and using private clinics in the public system, they oppose that too. More talk and action, Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House. Mr. Speaker, after a lot of talk about long-term care in this province from when they were in government and when they've been sitting over on the opposition side, on the long-term care front, this side is actually building long-term care facilities and adding beds, Mr. Speaker. Not just in the rural areas, but at a place like the Catholic Health Ministry, Amicus, the Catholic Health Ministry project in Saskatoon. That again, the Leader of the Opposition opposed that project. Railed against that faith-based approach to long-term care facilities. By the way, that's added dementia capacity in Saskatoon, Mr. Speaker, and we note the Leader of the Opposition stands up and say, we need more dementia capacity in Saskatoon and right across the province, but don't partner with the faith-based community to get it done, because we can't support that unless it's done the same old, tired, ineffective, NDP ideological way. And by the way, if you take a look at how the seats are set up in this House, you will know that the people of the province have voted for action and not talk and ideology on that side of the House. Mr. Speaker, the most important thing we can do in a budget is ensure that it's balanced. Arguably, the long-term legacy of any particular budget is that it avoids borrowing for operations. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that for the 7th time in the life of this government, the Finance Minister, first Mr. Ganafor and now the current member for Kenora-Pelly, has stood in his place and delivered one of Canada's only balanced budgets, Mr. Speaker. That means we're not going to add to that unsupported debt, where we're not making principal payments and only trying to track the interest rates. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, if I may just close with this, I think that is the reason why the budget's been well received. That it's got the fundamentals right. There's infrastructure investments that are important. There is investments in healthcare and education, building on success there. There's support for our most vulnerable, Mr. Speaker, but it's done in the framework of fiscal probity, responsibility. It's a summary budget for the first time in the province's history, and it is balanced. And it is why I believe, Mr. Speaker, that kind of budgeting is why I believe that we can look to the words of the NDP member for Athabasca. Because the NDP member for Athabasca said more about this budget and previous budgets than anyone on this side of the House could say, because in a clarion moment of just honesty to the Northern Pride paper in Meadow Lake on 17 September 2013, it says, and I quote, "The Athabasca NDP MLA said he is pleased with how things have been shaping up for the province financially under the reign of the current Saskatchewan Party government." I don't think there's anyone more surprised to get that kind of endorsement from the NDP than that member's old friend and Leafs fan, the member for Kenora-Pelly and the Finance Minister. Mr. Speaker, we're going to hear from the Minister of Finance, and then we're going to have a vote. A couple of members have been asking for some very specific things over there. The member for Cumberland has been wanting a long-term care facility. It's in the budget. It's his chance to vote for that facility. The member for Regina Elphinstone has been working hard for Sacred Heart School, doing a good job of making the case. It's in the budget, Mr. Speaker. Regina members have been advocating for Connaught. It's also in the budget. The Leader of the Opposition wants a school in his area, in his constituency. It's certainly related and involved in the budgeting for the province of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, the member for Athabasca has said the finances for the provinces are good under the Saskatchewan Party. Here's a chance for all of them to do something that I think we've only ever seen the member for Kindersley do, at least in the contemporary history of this government, where an opposition member actually had the courage of his conviction to stand up, as the member for Kindersley did when he was in opposition, and vote in favour of an NDP budget. You see, Mr. Speaker, what he had been doing is advocating for no PST increase in the budget. He wasn't asking the NDP government of the day to cut PST. He was just saying, don't increase it because it hurts us on the west side. And he made a commitment. He said, if you will do that, notwithstanding other concerns I might have in the budget, I will support the budget because it's the right thing to do. It's the principled thing to do. Well, Mr. Speaker, we don't just have one thing that had been asked for by members opposite. There is a grocery list, from summary financials to specific schools to long-term care facilities. Now is the chance for the NDP, on a principled basis, to vote in favour of action instead of only ever talking about the challenges, talking about the issues they want to bring forward to the legislature. I'm personally looking forward to that. I think we're all anxious to see how that works out. I think if there's a few over there that are still thinking of voting against the budget, I'm confident the Minister of Finance is going to convince them as well. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to make way for him, and I want to encourage members opposite to vote for a balanced budget that meets the interests and the desires that they have raised in this Assembly. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to indicate that I will be voting in favour of action instead of talk. I'll be voting for the budget and against the amendment. Yeah.